I want to thank you for joining me again as we continue on with our series, From Other to One Another, our daily devotional series that accompanying our Sunday morning sermon series. I want to thank you for joining us for that as we explore the richness of our relationships with one another. Let me take some time this morning to talk to those that have defined themselves more as the negative kind of people, those that see things around them through a negative lens. Because often when we do that, we often also view others through that negative lens. Sometimes what that makes us do is that makes us blame others for the situation that we are in when they have had little or nothing to do with the situation, where much of the situation has more to do with ourselves and and how we've conducted ourselves than anything that anybody else has done. But as a negative person, sometimes what we do is we don't accept the negative of ourselves. We project that negative on someone else. And it becomes a problem with our worldview. It becomes a problem with our relationship with God. In James chapter 5, James says, "Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." Now, there in the midst of that context, he's talking about the grumbling or complaining not to someone, but about someone. That we take and we grumble, we complain, we murmur, we have a grudge against somebody else because of something that's going on in the midst of our lives, and we pin the blame on that person. We alienate that person. We make them responsible for how we're feeling. But in that verse, James doesn't specifically address the negative result that happens within our relationship with the other person. What he does is talks about the issue of judging, that when we complain, when we grumble against each other, we place ourselves in a seat of judgment towards one another. Again, we've talked about the issue early on about not judging one another. And here he says the judge is waiting at the door. Who is that? Well, the judge is God. But what happens is when we grumble and we complain, we have established ourselves in the seat of judgment, and we have dethroned God. That's where our complaining and holding a grudge and grumbling against one another becomes a problem. Because only one person can sit in the judgment seat. That position is only granted to one person, and let me give you a hint, it's not you or I. The only one who's justified to sit there is God. And when we take and we grumble and we complain, actually what we're doing is saying, God, you're to blame. You're guilty because you haven't taken care of this. It runs in contrast with the opening verses of James, where James says, in contrast with grumbling and complaining about your situation by placing blame on each other, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you are faced with trials of many kinds. James takes that complaint worldview and flips it on its head and says, be content, be joyful in the midst. Don't complain. Don't go on the attack. Don't murmur and grumble against others. Figure out how God is going to grow you in the midst of it. Let each other off the hook. Sometimes we do harm one another, and sometimes we've got legitimate complaints. But even when the legitimacy of the complaint is that we feel like we have the responsibility of attacking one another, we got a problem. This week the last several days we've spent much time with the negative stuff, and we're going to get back to the positive stuff. But it's also important for us to understand what we need to avoid in our relationships with one another in order to live a life that honors God, that reflects Him.